This video is sponsored by War Thunder. More on that later on.
Saints Row the Third, to me, has always been the pivotal point in the series. I don't think the Saints Row metamorphosis is as drastic as some believe, and I don't believe that pre and post Saints Row 3 is all that different, but I do think there was a significant point where the series became something else and jumped the shark. And that was Saints Row 4. Why am I talking about Saints Row 3? Because it was the ramp. I think while 4 was the pivotal point, 3 set up a lot of where the series would go. It brought the series to the mainstream, and I think even the reboot, for as much as it failed to revitalize the series, seemed to mimic the third game the most because Volition knew it was where they found the most success and the strongest balance between crime drama and goofy Grand Theft Auto alternative. While I know the conversation around Saints Row being a GTA clone is a tired one, I am going to retread it a bit because it's necessary context, and it properly frames why I believe Saints Row 3 made the decisions it did. With that said, let's discuss the origins of Saints Row, which was a GTA clone. Don't take my word for it, take the creative director's words. I think calling something a clone, even if an acknowledgement of similarities, is a bit too restrictive of a term, and tends to omit the personal touch that art naturally has. If Rockstar and Volition wanted to make the same game, it would still turn out wildly different just based on the individuals on each team. Now, the difference here is that GTA already trailblazed and Saints Row was made with being a GTA clone in mind. At the time, there wasn't an open world crime game for the Xbox 360. Now, seeing how Rockstar were able to deliver with Grand Theft Auto 4 and 5, it's clear that taking their time paid off, as those games not only sold much more than Saints Row, but their cultural significance dwarfs Saints Row on a bad day. But we need to keep this in mind because, for as much as Saints Row had great ideas and was a good game, look at the review scores, it certainly had a goal, and that goal was to fill a gap in the market. Grand Theft Auto 4 released in 2008, and by that time blew the world away. I know some think it's overrated, but come on, the game looks great, has a stellar story, and most importantly, was the de facto open world crime game. Unless you had something unique to separate yourself from the GTA titan like Sleeping Dogs, you weren't going to get very far, and even then Sleeping Dogs regularly got called GTA Hong Kong. The GTA games have always been quite funny, but their humor was always in a more subtle way, and was always a satirical critique of American culture. Grand Theft Auto 4 offered a biting analysis of the American dream, but masked it with enough action and humor to avoid being a buzzkill. With this shifting tone comes a new gap for Saints Row to fill. Now, instead of simply being a more accessible GTA, in the sense that it was the only open world game on modern hardware, they now had to make it more accessible by offering the over-the-top humor people loved from Grand Theft Auto, but without the maturity and truthful undertones that shackled it to reality. Despite leaning into slapstick and, let's be honest, bottom-of-the-barrel humor at times, Saints Row 3 has its own interesting takes on success, commercialization, and finding a new identity, something the series itself was no doubt struggling with at the time. Rather than meet this new market with a tightening grip on Rockstar's coattails, Volition instead grabbed their 4-foot dildo bat and came out swinging. So this is Saints Row 3, 15 years later. The game opens in the city of Stillwater, where the first two games took place. By now, the Saints have become a parody of themselves. This is the first example of what I mean when I say the game doesn't exactly have the same subtlety as Grand Theft Auto. They quite literally put the jokes in your face. The Saints have, in so many ways, become successful enough to sponsor energy drinks. While they rob a bank, they dress up as their mascot, Johnny Gat, known for how funny he was in the first games. They have an actor who is along for the ride to further sell how commercialized they've become, and there's this sense throughout the beginning that the bankers are more or less used to this. When they raise the alarms and start fighting back, the crew is shocked because their life has become so monotonous up to this point. It's this staleness, either in the Saints or in Volition's ambitions, that is punished. The Saints are threatened when the bank starts fighting back and things go haywire instantly. As if a statement from Volition, however, the Saints adapt, and I can't help but see this opening as a perfect metaphor for the game itself, especially when we consider the protagonist's reliance on maintaining the mask, even once it's no longer necessary. It's like saying that they will adapt, but won't lose sight of where they came from. It's also a handy way of keeping the player character hidden until the character creator is available, which is directly after the bank heist goes wrong and the Saints are captured by Loren, a Steelport businessman who owned the bank that they robbed, hence the increased resistance. The character creator is something the Saints game have always done to separate itself. It gets even better in 3 given that there are even more options. It's become a defining part of the series and further explains why this is the player's story. This isn't Nico or Wei, this is the boss. I can't discuss the character creator too much because there isn't much to say aside from it's good, but I can at least say that the default outfits and the general canon appearance of the boss in a suit further tells the player, even if they are unfamiliar with the previous games, that the Saints are at the top of their game, and it makes their crash landing all the more real, despite only meeting our crew a few minutes ago. The crew is held hostage on a plane flying over Steelport. They are able to escape, but not before Johnny Gat is killed in action, and not without a great set piece. Once on the ground, they see that their bank accounts are frozen, and it's back to square one. I like to think of this story as in a self-coined reminder category. A protagonist from a previous film has either retired or in this case gotten soft, and they need a story to get them back on top. It reminds them of where the ground is. Infamous 2 starts you with all the powers of the first game before they are drained, and now you start from more or less square one. A similar structure is used in Uncharted 4, where Nate gets to go on one last journey and remember the thrill of the hunt. With that in mind, the beginning of Saints Row 3 is fantastic. What's most notable is that it does a lot with a little. For as much as I glazed Grand Theft Auto 4 in my video on the game, its level design was rather formulaic, and its shooting just as much. Saints Row's answer to this is more flash, bigger set pieces, shooting while skydiving, and what makes these moments the most enjoyable in retrospect is that it's typically only done once. For the example of skydiving, it's done here and never again. At most, the idea is half reused when doing a free fall in a tank, and we'll see that throughout the story and the side missions, that Saints Row has more than enough original ideas, but sometimes it gets so focused on showing you what it can do that it begins to miss the forest for the trees. This is evident in the first act of the game, which, outside of the opening hour, slows to a crawl, and on repeat playthroughs especially, feels longer and longer each time, where we are painstakingly shown the side content on display.
You see the lineup to get into this place? It takes forever. Fortunately, I can play War Thunder while I wait. Because not only is War Thunder the most realistic and immersive war sim free, but it's also on mobile, so I can start at home and pick up where I left off on the go. They have a ton of different tanks, planes, and battleships across an entire century. You can drop right into battle with any of the thousands of detailed vehicles, and they come with a sophisticated damage system. This ain't your daddy's video game, because we don't have hitboxes, okay? We have detailed system components in each vehicle. You don't simply deplete your enemy's health bar, you disable their engine. You pick apart different components like a scientist dissecting a frog. And if you're unlucky enough to get hit, or if you just suck at the game, I can relate, you get a full X-ray breakdown of what parts got hit and how much of an impact it had. There are 3 different modes to play, all ranging from an arcadey style to more realistic mil sim modes. And all of this runs really well on the in-house Dagor engine that ensures that this game can run on basically anything. Personally, as a history buff, I love how historically accurate all the vehicles are. They really feel like they're ripped right out from the past. And I think half the reason they have the X-ray feature in the game is because they're just showing off. If you are interested in joining the other 95 million players on PC, Xbox, PlayStation, and mobile, then click the link in the pinned comment and the description. And if you're a new player or you haven't played in 6 months, then you'll get an exclusive welcome bonus that includes a sweet vehicle, some premium currency, and a full week of premium account subscription. It's only for a limited time, and it's only available on consoles and PCs though, so you need to act fast. So click the link if you're interested, and thank you so much to War Thunder for sponsoring this portion of the video.
Much of our first act is about establishing the Saints in Steelport, and that means getting a base of operations, a crew, and connections. Getting a new base, a downtown penthouse, is one of the better missions in the game, no doubt aided by Kanye West's power scoring the set piece. I think this penthouse, often referred to as the Saints' headquarters, showcases the different frame of mind we find the Saints in. In previous games, our goals were closer aligned to the typical gangster story: get money, kill rival gangs, and own the streets. Here, the Saints are starting from the bottom, but with years of experience, so the game tends to skip the small things and head straight into building an empire. When a game features some sort of power reset, such as having to take over a new city, it's wise to streamline the basics so that fans familiar with the games don't feel as though they are forced to grind. Instead, they can get that beginning hustle out of the way and move on to the bigger set pieces. We spend a fair bit of our intro to Steelport being shown gun stores, clothing stores, and how the city works in the sense that we can buy property, store vehicles, and need to avoid not just the police, but but the rival gangs too. Typically, these different stores we visit are across districts, so a player is forced to see the map, learn the driving controls, and get a feel for the game before they get into the good stuff. I think our initial exploration in Steelport is some of the best game design I've seen in an open world game where the goal is to get the player up to speed, but it also makes certain annoyances clear from the moment the game starts. And because the city generally doesn't progress, it means these annoyances never cease. For example, a freeway runs across most of the districts, and while it's convenient for the sake of travel, it's almost too convenient. The GPS often put me on this freeway, and the freeway is simply boring. I know that sounds stupid. Yeah, it's a fucking freeway, and I'm not saying we need to spruce it up or remove it, but I think the open world of Steelport is generally pretty weak. However, seeing it from this view makes it significantly worse. This isn't an issue exclusive to Saints Row, however. Arkham Origins and Grand Theft Auto 4 both have large bridges that served as a pain in the ass to traverse simply because players had to do it too much. The luxury Saints Row can maintain is that players simply don't have to use it. The GPS is often used to get you from point A to B, and if speed is the desire, then yeah, the freeway will get you there, but I think a wise choice would have been to have the GPS generally steer you away from it so you can indulge in some of the city's strengths on the way to an objective. When driving on the highways, we can crash into poles, fences, and people, all things that crumble under the weight of our car. It's not simply fulfilling a sadistic desire, more importantly, it's fulfilling a certain tactility. It's satisfying to see a simple cause and effect, to see our vehicle make an impact in the world. A world that can be killed is one that's ultimately alive, and it's why it's so annoying to crash into a small bush and have it stop your car dead in its tracks. On the freeway, however, there's none of that. It's a straight line, traffic maybe, and that's it. There's no street lamps to slam into, no people to run over, no reminder that this world is more than set dressing. Even the views themselves pale in comparison to the streets, because even if Steelport is not as interesting as its contemporaries, it at least has things to see other than a skybox. The next annoyance with the freeway is that because of its purpose of being the fastest way from A to B, it means the traffic can impede progress without a trade-off. Saints Row the Third likes to do this thing where, for some reason, cars will just swerve into you, and I think this is intentional. This isn't intentional in a traffic sense. Cars, if at an intersection, will use their turn signal. I mean, they will just spin out on the road, and it always causes a crash, and I think this is intentional because 1, it happens too often, and 2, it provides benefits to gameplay outside of the freeway. If all the cars follow the rules of the road, then congrats, you have boring traffic. Remember that tactility I mentioned when crashing into things? Yeah, that's fun. So why not have the traffic occasionally mess with the player, cause them to get into a crash, make the drive more eventful, maybe even have them crash into a cop and start a chase? I'm sure you could see how this could be beneficial. On the freeway, however, there is no trade-off for the impedance. You not only lose speed, but sometimes flat out get pushed off the freeway, and there is no reward, no trade. And this makes motorcycles practically unusable because if the game decides to boot you off, then you go flying, and that's only fun the first handful of times. And it gets really old when it's not your fault. Side note, even on the street, motorcycles are awful because the game insists on centering the camera at all times, meaning it was hard to look around while turning, and there's no setting to fix this or turn it off. This was less of an issue in cars because a crash didn't often mean a full ejection from the vehicle, and instead just an inconvenience. Otherwise, driving feels pretty good. It lacks some of the weight of other games, and advanced maneuvers like J-turns aren't possible. In fact, trying to do so results in the physics flat out breaking, but for what it's worth, I do like it, and the game does a good job of presenting speed in a vehicle without resorting to white speed lines on the screen. There is, however, a strange ghosting effect on vehicles that seems to be only present in the remastered version of the game. I generally don't love remasters, but I'll admit that in this instance, it's pretty good. It just changes the lighting and makes some of the textures better. I think the strongest part of the remaster is that it manages to keep the jank in the game. I'm not going to say that glitches are a sign of quality per se, but I do think that certain glitches like getting hit by a car and then subsequently getting stuck in that car gives the game a particular charm that I'm glad remains. When it comes to the rest of the general gameplay, a lot of it is tutorialized in the beginning act. I'd say it's pretty good and holds up surprisingly well, and shooting especially feels really good. The weapons all have enough oomph to be viable, though I will admit that the Shepard pistols dominate the roster, and I say that while the game can lean into damage-punched territory with its enemies, it ends up still being a lot of fun, and I think the reason enemies get so beefy near the end of the game is because the devs wanted you to move on from bullets and instead start pursuing more explosive means of dispatching your enemies. enemies. The game isn't afraid to drop miniguns, airstrikes, tanks, flying tanks, and much more on you. And for as much as Saints Row has never been the pinnacle of fidelity, the explosions in these games always look so good, and the sound design is great here too. However, when I mention the game tutorializes in the beginning, it's not just in the mechanical sense, but in a showcasing sense too. For example, during what I'll call the first act of the game, you'll be taken around Steelport to meet some new characters like Kinsey and Zemos, and each crew member has an associated arc alongside them. What these arcs amount to are some cutscenes and side content. Now I want to clarify that I don't think introducing side content is bad, and I think given that the side content is good here, it's not that big of a deal. But I do think the game spends far too long asking us to do different activities, and it becomes further grating when we factor in certain challenges being more or less the same. For example, Escort has two variants we need to do. One where you drive around a VIP client for Zemos, avoiding paparazzi and performing tasks to satisfy the client, and the other variant sees you driving to satisfy a tiger, avoiding animal rights activists and performing tasks to keep the client, I mean tiger, happy. They are still under the category of escort, but it means that for both Angel and Zemos, you are doing these missions back to back, on top of how often you'd be doing them outside of the story. I want to make it clear that I don't think the side content is bad, but that, inherent to being side content, it's not as good as the main stuff. The other problem we run into with this setup is that it feels repetitive, not in the content itself, but in the structure. I recently replayed this game with my wife last year, and even she, someone who had never played a Saints Row game, was saying that the structure of each mission was just a character showing us a side mission and moving on. The upside to this loop is that it shows you the different ways to make money. I have played this game with countless people. Whenever a friend says they want to play a co-op game, Saints Row 3 to me is a great time, and seeing that they can control parts of the city and earn income from it always becomes a game in and of itself. And I think it speaks to a game's quality when completing the side activities becomes just as fun and engaging as the main content. Games like Cyberpunk get their stories put on the back burner the moment contracts are available, and a similar sentiment is shared here. The activities themselves range from different flavors of time trials, collectibles, and gang hideouts for you to clear. Clearing the gang hideouts can eventually become all too easy, but I think it's neat that clearing them gives you a wanted level from the respective gang. It became a fun minigame. Otherwise, I want to talk about a few of the different activities and highlight their strengths and weaknesses. The Professor Genki Super Reality Climax is stellar and by far the best minigame in the series in my opinion. It's a funny premise, is a genuine challenge in most cases due to the limitations on health and ammo, and as you progress you'll have hunters released. These are minigun brutes that, even with my relatively well upgraded weapons, were a consistent challenge due to how much damage they inflict so quickly, and because they are on infinite spawn. They reward stupid money if you kill them, so there is an inherent risk and reward. Do you avoid the hunter to make it out alive, or try to take a few down for some extra cash? My only complaint is that their spawn point is unclear, so there would be times where I have two on me, kill one, and then another spawns directly in front of me, making escape practically impossible. Otherwise, these are great. Other side activities suffer from the opposite issue, however, of being too easy. Guardian Angel missions, aside from their boring and repetitive nature, are insanely easy. You're often given an overpowered weapon, which isn't inherently an issue, and then like one car of enemies every 30 seconds. This means that we have an absurd amount of downtime, and that's ignoring the other annoyances like the camera angle. It's almost funny, but when you're in a helicopter with the rocket launcher, half the time you can't see the enemies because the big ass gun is in the way of the camera. Now, when I criticize a game for being too easy, it's not because I want fucking Melania to show up and whoop my ass, but it's because I want to stay engaged. Having moments where we are protecting one of the homies and there's no enemies, no dialogue, and no music is just boring, because there's literally nothing happening. Turning up the enemy spawn rate fixes this easily, and when we look at the Professor Genki activities, we can see that if Volition wants to create an environment where we pay more attention, then they are capable of doing that through challenge. This pacing issue isn't exclusive to a lack of challenge, but at other times it's due to a lack of life. I can't for the love of God figure out why, but there are so many missions like Mayhem, Tank Mayhem, Insurance Fraud, and Helicopter Mayhem where there's just nobody around. Sometimes you get these pockets where it seems like the whole town gathered for the day, but most times the Mayhem mission saw me either farming the police that showed up, or I was just blowing up a barren wasteland. Now, this could have been due to wanting the game to be more than mindless destruction. If that's the case, lame, but it did at least make the game a more strategic endeavor. I noticed that certain things like people and streetlights never gave me many points in Mayhem, but fences did, and fences were often, by nature of being a fence, clumped up. The way you get more points in Mayhem is to keep a combo going, so I began strategically destroying everything but the fences and saving them as a buffer in case my combo was about to expire. I initially wondered if the city was empty to prevent frame drops, but this issue doesn't show up in the tank mayhem missions, so I have to assume it's either a bug or a design decision that I don't yet understand. Ultimately, the side content is still good, because for as much as I have criticisms, every time I replay this game, I always do the side content first. It's just a good side game, a great way of exploring the city, and allows me to feel like the Saints are making a true grassroots expansion into a new city. Now, I do think some are better than others for various reasons, and difficulty is often part of it, but they typically didn't last long enough for me to mind too much in the moment, even if I just spent a few minutes droning on about it. I also think, in retrospect, it's kind of refreshing to see an open world map full of activities and yet no towers to climb or maps to fill. It helps this game stand out from the rest, especially compared to Saints Row 4, which, for as much as I love it, does show early symptoms of that open world syndrome. Fortunately, there is always a sense of progression from these activities because they give you cash, respect, and most importantly, hourly income. With each property you buy and activity you complete, you can increase your hourly income. This creates a separate game, so to speak, because the goal then becomes about snowballing your income. Do activities and earn money and cash flow, reinvest that cash flow into more properties, rinse and repeat. I know I sometimes present myself as a smarty pants on this channel, but fuck me if seeing a number go up isn't the most addicting drug. It also feeds into progression. With the more money you can get, the more upgrades, better weapons, and generally more fun you can have. These upgrades get stupid expensive as you go on, so investing early is wise, and I wish more games had systems like this. The other currency you'll earn is respect, which can be classified as a social currency that is earned by doing cool things. Buying new clothes, driving into oncoming traffic, drifting, just about everything will earn you respect. And what I like about this system most is that it encourages you to get lost in the sandbox. When talking about the driving in the freeway, I mentioned that the cars would swerve into you so that players could experience the goofier side of the sandbox, and it's convenient that you get respect for running over people, blowing up cars, and doing practically anything else. Once again, the game wants you to engage with the world, drive recklessly, and essentially live the stereotypical gangster lifestyle. And that's exactly why the police are so relaxed in this game. In most other crime games, the police are a threat, but more often than not, the gangs are the biggest threat in Steelport. Police operate in a typical fashion in regards to scale, with 5 stars bringing in the military and eventually STAG, the city's super military agency. However, I'm not sure if this is intentional, but the police tend to forget about you much faster than the gangs. I think this is because the police aren't as fun to fight in a game like this. We want gang wars, and 2, it's a funny way of showcasing how Steelport became so overrun with crime and how the Saints' actions generally go unpunished, despite constantly blowing helicopters out of the sky. The cops just don't care that much, at least for now. The game's third act does introduce STAG, and they begin actively hunting the player near the end of the game as the city tries to crack down on crime. A final note on notoriety, I like that the different gangs don't have loyalty to each other, and if one gang shoots a cop that is chasing me, that cop will stop what he's doing and go after the more pressing threat. Like many open world games, Saints Row 3 is always waiting on your next move, but this system creates moments where that didn't feel the case. There's a final part about the open world I want to mention, and that is the customization. Purchasing property changes nothing about it. Buying a store gives a discount and allows you to use it for solace from the gangs, but outside of 3 bases in the game, I would have liked to have seen a better customization for buildings to make it really feel like the Saints own Steelport. Fortunately, once you clear out a gang in an area, Saints will start populating those areas instead of the local gang. And since you can customize what the gang looks like, in my case they were ninjas and wearing the Saints' iconic purple, it meant that the Saints' iconography was present across the map, and where there were purple cars and purple ninjas, I knew there was safety. I've spoken rather broadly so far about the story and the missions within it, and that's mostly because it's where the bread and butter is. We get the best humor, the best set pieces, some really interesting gameplay scenarios, and while the story itself is nothing too deep, I don't think it was ever aiming for much more than an excuse to get us from one fun moment to the next. I mean, shit, one of the missions in the game has one of Steelport's islands being turned into a zombie-infested wasteland, and we're tasked with stopping it by the mayor, who is none other than Burt Reynolds, because why not, I guess. I think this is where Saints Row 3 separates itself truly from the other GTA clones. It throws subtlety out the window and leans entirely into the absurd, the slapstick, and I think its over-the-top nature actually works in the game's favor most of the time. I think when you have a game like GTA 4 where there is subtle humor beneath the more overt jokes, some of it goes over the player's head, or more accurately, some of its biting sarcasm is played straight enough that it's considered a genuine commentary. We see this often with comedies across mediums, where they parody something so well or so accurately that the people they are parodying end up believing the comedy is actually in support of them. However, because Saints Row is almost never subtle, it means that it can say basically whatever it wants and the audience will understand that it's meant in jest. It's like when a comedian says something completely offside. People generally assume that what they're saying is a joke because that's kind of the whole shtick. I think this did mean it was difficult to take the story seriously, but it also meant that there were practically no jokes that I found flat out unfunny. I think this game, for what it's worth, is fucking hysterical. I like to judge a game's humor based not on my subjective enjoyment of it, though it is an undeniable factor I suppose, but also by the variety of humor and how it impacts the story. In Saints Row 3's case, it's about as unpredictable as it gets. Sometimes I was swinging a massive dildo at people, sometimes it was goofy humor like Pierce being noticeably distracted on a phone call because he's playing chess. Other times it was an entire mission where you raid a brothel, saving a stereotypical pimp who is of course named after a car and only speaks in autotune. It's completely offside and I love it. I think my favorite part about returning to Saints Row 3 in my adult years is how much certain jokes have grown on me. When first playing this game as a teenager, I appreciated a lot of the over-the-top humor more, because as far as I was concerned at the time, shock and awe was the name of the game. But these days, I find myself appreciating the more dad humor-esque jokes on display. I love the contrast between the serious nature of crime and the Looney Tunes approach of the Saints. The 3rd Street Saints are the only gang to actively wait in traffic, and this cutscene kills me every time. When you finish an escort mission, sometimes a client will call out that they'll see her again in 9 months, and it's like, fuck me. It's so rare that I play a game that gets this many laughs out of me. Unfortunately, the things surrounding the humor don't always land. For example, you'll hear a character repeat the same dialogue over and over. I've probably heard Pierce say, "just like old times," on 100 separate occasions through my roughly 20-hour playthrough. Cutscene volume isn't in its own setting, and it is instead tied to the sound effects slider, not the voiceover slider. Sometimes an enemy just won't die, like you can pump endless bullets into them and they'll be invincible because the game says so. Admittedly, there are a million different glitches in the game, and Saints Row 3 at times feels like it's being held together with hopes and dreams, but 9 times out of 10, the surrounding goofiness of the game makes the glitches feel tonally consistent with the world, in a similar way that Skate 3's glitches do. The other problem the game's goofiness runs into is that when it wants to take itself a bit seriously, it's a Titan-esque tonal clash. During your arrival to Sealport, Johnny Gat is killed off-screen, and it seems like Shaundi is the only one who gives a shit. She's grieving his death throughout the game, and is mostly doing that off-screen. As in cutscenes, she's either delivering jokes as the straight woman who's all business, or is being a damsel in distress not once, but twice. Now, killing Johnny is a big deal for fans of previous games, especially because more often than not, he was the funniest parts of those games. But for the new player, he means nothing, and it's not exactly like his appearance in this game is enough to make us instantly fall in love. I think killing Johnny is supposed to represent leaving Stillwater behind. This is the next step for Saints Row, and in order to move forward, they need to be ready to leave the past behind. And to that degree, I can appreciate this. However, his death is more of an afterthought to the Saints, and if that truly be the case, then that needs to be reflected by Shaundi too. Or maybe Shaundi's refusal to let Johnny go is another side of that dichotomy of moving on. Shaundi is a tonal clash with the rest of the group. Despite being an OG, Pierce seems to have much more pull than her, being the gang's pseudo-publicist. He's even in the first scene promoting Saints Flow energy drinks. Compare Shaundi, the all-business type, to other serious characters like Kinsey, and we can see that even she has some humor underneath everything. If this were the case for our main character, being serious in an inherently goofy world, then perhaps this dynamic could work. But Shaundi's refusal to adapt leaves her getting left behind more often than not. This setup feels like it's leading to a decision between Shaundi and the gang's reputation, and yet the final decision is between saving the mayor Shaundi Viola, who's essentially Shaundi's replacement, and a Steelport monument, or killing a character we met face to face for the first time 20 minutes earlier. For as much as I like decisions in games, why the fuck would anyone not pick saving Shaundi? The story is generally structured around 3 antagonists all along the gang hierarchy. We have Loren, who is dispatched rather early, Matt, who's fortunate to have one of the coolest levels in the game, and finally Killbane. Killbane is shown to be the head honcho, and one of our final missions is in unmasking him, which as a luchador is basically a career ender. He might be alive, but he is spiritually defeated. We have no reason to chase him down, but if he had Shaundi, then the choice becomes a bit more difficult. There are choices throughout the game, and most of them boil down to either money or reputation. Do you want the Saints to make a statement, or do you just want them to get cash? There's a consistent tug of war between presenting the Saints as an actual gang and as a brand. If we reframe the ending decision as follows, I think we'd see a more difficult choice. Shaundi is going after Killbane before he skips town, but the usual crew is at the monument with the bombs. Do we either A, stick to our gang, save Shaundi, and make a statement that the Saints own Steelport, or do you save the new gang, possibly earn a higher hourly income, and save the Saints' reputation as good guys in Steelport? I still don't think this proposed solution could work all that well because this decision is spiritually presented at many points across the story, and it's always chosen for you. Shaundi and Pierce are often providing 2 approaches, and your character will always choose the more fun option, and thus it feels like the developer's expression of where they specifically want the series to go, as if every time one of these narrative forks come up, they use it as a way of pleading their case. They're saying, sure, this might not be the most gangster approach, but it's the most fun, and that's ultimately what we want. If we consider the Shaundi approach to be more in line with GTA, then a refusal to engage in the serious is an even more obvious statement. It's important to remember that by the time Saints Row 3 released, there was a GTA game on 7th gen hardware. They had to find more ways to separate Saints Row, the brand, from GTA, because if they didn't, they ran the risk of remaining in its shadow and thus capping their profits in the process. I think this is why Saints Row 3 leans so much more into the fantastical, into destruction being the end instead of the means. I remember when GTA 5 first released, plenty of people around me said that the Trevor character, one characterized by enjoying the destruction a life of crime warrants, as being Rockstar's answer to Saints Row. Now, I don't think that is an accurate picture, but the point here is that within public perception, Saints Row was identified as something that GTA not only had to answer to, but something crazier than the typical GTA. If we compare the 2 most recent releases at the time, we see that one game asks that you, as a walking toilet and blow-up doll, shoot different enemies in a simulation, playing text-based adventures and eventually having a dragon-on-dragon sword fight, and the other asks you to drive your cousin to a back alley gambling den. One asks you sink a port-bound helicarrier, and the other has robbing a bank as the major set piece. Bigger isn't better, but it is different, and that's what matters. I could spend ages just going over all the fun set pieces, but I think the most important part about these different wacky moments is that there's always commitment. When entering the Decker's network, it's not as if the toilet using a Mega Man blaster is the end of the set piece. They incorporate lag, inverted controls, and other means of bringing this moment to life. It's not just for the gag, it's for the exercise, and an entertaining change-up. While a zombie mission is entirely out of the blue, it ends up being fun because as the game limits our stamina, and given that we use a gun with a long charge-up time, we have to herd the horde to get the most out of our weapon and conserve stamina like we would in any other zombie game. This sweetens how much Saints Row 3 commits to the bit. As far as voices go for your character, one option is to have them speak like a zombie, and they have an entire set of voice lines for this mode. In my case, I chose to have a British voice, and in that case, they used plenty of UK-based slang in their dialogue. It became clear as I played that the team must have encouraged the voice actors to ad-lib some stuff, and it makes the dialogue feel much more natural than it otherwise would have, and for a comedic game like this, that's a great strength. Ultimately, I think the reason I find myself returning to Saints Row 3 the most out of the other games is that it was the only game where it felt different enough to be unworthy of being any kind of clone, but not so over the top that it became a parody of itself. I mean, sure, there is definitely some self-parody here, but otherwise, the game uses that self-deprecating humor to analyze how a brand must change in order to continue growing and even thriving. If we choose to finish off Killbane, he'll gloat about how he got the Saints back, turning them into gangsters again, and not glorified celebrities promoting energy drinks and focusing on branding rather than actually owning the streets. This is a phenomenon we see in real life too. Imagine some of your favorite artists or streamers, even YouTubers. When they were the underdog, it was easy to rally behind them, lifting them up as a proxy for yourself, and it's why most people who blow up tend to do so from a place of authenticity. But eventually, that success changes them. No longer can they afford to be themselves, they now need to worry about their image and their brand, and because that brand is what allows their life of luxury, they arrive at a fork in the road. Either allow this new brand-friendly persona to bury you alive, or reject it and fade into obscurity. It's hard for the Saints to remain gangsters because they are simply too successful. They are a brand now, and the tragedy of the ending choice is that either way, a part of the Saints dies. Either one of its beloved members or its position as a street gang. The brand either stays in the past or moves forward to become quite literally all that's left of Earth, as if a representation of Earth itself. Saints Row 3 was the last time we had a proper balance between the gangster lifestyle and the absurd over-the-top humor that separated the Saints. While I think Saints Row 4 is just as good, and in fact might even be better in some ways, it's severely an apples and oranges comparison, so I won't bother comparing it. Regardless, I think Saints Row 3 is an utterly fantastic game, despite how old it is. And that's exceptional given that humor, at least I find, ages very quickly, especially when it's referential. If you haven't played it in a while, I'd say it's worth looking at again. And if you haven't played it ever, then whoa, what the fuck are you doing? You're having the whole thing spoiled!
Once again, thank you to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. And if you want to join the 95 million players on PC, Xbox, and PlayStation, then click the link in the description or the pinned comment, and I'll see you on the battlefield.